The entire heart is made up of cardiac muscle tissue which is capable of generating action potential or electric impulses. However, it is the sinoatrial node which triggers the cardiac contraction by generating the electric impulses. The repeating pattern of contraction and relaxation of the heart is called as the cardiac cycle. Now let's take that all the four chambers of the heart are in a state of relaxation. This state where all the four chambers of the heart are in a relaxed state is called as the joint diastole. That is the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle and the left ventricle. That is all the four chambers of the heart are in a relaxed state. It is called as the joint diastole. So let me explain the cardiac cycle beginning with the joint diastole. So now let's say all the four chambers of the heart are in a relaxed state, that is they are in joint diastole. Now the deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava, from the inferior vena cava and the coronary sinuses drain into the right atrium. Simultaneously, oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins drains into the left atrium. Now, as and how the blood fills into both the atrium, that is the right atrium and the left atrium, there is an increase in the pressure. There is a pressure buildup in the atrium which forces the atrioventricular valves to open. That is, the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve are forced to open because of the increase in the pressure in the atrium. And blood starts flowing into the ventricles. That is, from the right atrium into the right ventricle and from the left atrium into the left ventricle. At this time, keep in mind, this is very, very important. Both the semilunar valves of the pulmonary artery and the aorta are closed. Okay, the semilunar valves are closed at this point of time. Now, the sinoatrial node, which is called as the pacemaker, generates an electric impulse which brings about simultaneous contraction of both the atrium. Okay, the sinoatrial node, which is located in the top right corner of the atrium, brings about an electric impulse which creates the simultaneous contraction of both the atrium, which results in increased blood flow to the ventricles. So because of the contraction of the atrium, which is called as atrial systole. Keep in mind, the contracted state of the heart is called as the systole and the relaxed state of the chambers is called as the diastole. So the sinoatrial node brings about contraction of the atrium, which is called as atrial systole. Okay, so with the atrial systole, there's an increased blood flow from the atrium to the ventricle by about 30%. Initially, because of the increased blood pressure, the atrioventricular valves were forced to open and blood was flowing into the ventricles. Now, with the atrial systole happening, there is an increase in 30%. By about 30%, there is an increased blood flow into the ventricles. At this time, the semilunar valves are closed. Keep this in mind. Okay, so once the blood has flown from the atrium, right atrium to the right ventricle and from the left atrium to the left ventricle, now there is an increase in the blood pressure. There is an increase in the pressure in the ventricles which forces the atrioventricular valves to close. That is, the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve are forced to close now because of the increase in the pressure in the ventricles, and also the electric impulse generated by the sinoatrial node is transmitted to the atrioventricular node. The atrioventricular node is located in the bottom left corner of the right atrium, and this electric impulse from the atrioventricular node travels all the way through the bundle of His and it brings about contraction of the entire ventricular musculature. Now, the ventricles enter into a systole, that is into a contracted state, and this is called as ventricular systole. Now, the ventricular systole happens and the semilunar valves of the pulmonary artery and the aorta are forced to open. When the ventricular systole happens and the pulmonary and the valves, semilunar valves of the pulmonary artery and the aorta are open, blood from the right ventricle is forced to push, or it is pumped into the pulmonary artery for pulmonary circulation, and blood from the left ventricle is pumped into the aorta, which enters into the systemic circulation. Okay, so you must also keep in mind that this contracted state of the ventricles, that is ventricular systole, is coinciding with atrial diastole. Okay, please keep in mind during ventricular systole, those atrioventricular valves are totally closed. Now, after pumping blood into the pulmonary artery and the aorta, now the ventricles begin to relax. The beginning of the relaxation of the ventricle leads to a fall in the pressure in the ventricles, and there's an increase in the pressure in the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Now there is a possibility of blood flowing back into the ventricles because of the low pressure that is created in the ventricles. In order to prevent this, as soon as the pressure drops in the ventricles, the semilunar valves are forced to close. That is, the semilunar valve of the pulmonary artery and the aorta close completely in order to prevent the backflow of the blood from the pulmonary artery and the aorta into the ventricles. Okay, so now after this, this completes one entire cycle, that is one cycle of systole of the atrium and the ventricles, and one cycle of the diastole of the atrium and the ventricle. That is one complete cycle of contraction and relaxation of the atrium and the ventricle, and this is called as the cardiac cycle. Okay, so did you all understand the mechanism of the cardiac cycle, how blood moves from the atrium to the ventricles, and from the ventricles they are pumped into the pulmonary artery for pulmonary circulation, and from the left ventricle into the aorta for the systemic circulation. Okay, did you understand what's the meaning of joint diastole? So from one joint diastole to the next joint diastole is what we call it as the cardiac cycle. That is one complete cycle of contraction and relaxation of the atrium and the ventricles. That is, when the atria are in a contracted state, the ventricles are in a relaxed state, and vice versa. That one entire cycle from one joint diastole to the next joint diastole is called as the cardiac cycle. Now, during every single time, the ventricles pump around approximately 70 ml of blood. Okay, that is both the ventricles together, that is the right ventricle and the left ventricle. During a single contraction, they pump around 70 ml of blood, and this is called as the stroke volume. That is the volume of blood the ventricles pump out during a single contraction or during a single cardiac cycle is called as the, sorry, it's not the cardiac cycle, during a single contraction. Okay, so during a single contraction, the ventricles are pumping out 70 ml of blood, and that is called as the stroke volume. Now, what is cardiac output? We know that the heart beats around 70 to 72 times. On an average, the heart rate is 72 times per minute, isn't it? So, when we multiply the volume of blood that is pumped out by the ventricles in a single contraction with the number of times it pumps in a single minute, that is 70 into 72. This is the heart rate, isn't it? Stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped by the ventricles in a single contraction, right? That is 70 ml. And heart rate, that is the number of times the heart beats in a minute, that is 72. So when we multiply 70 into 72, we get 5040 ml, which is approximately 5 liters of blood. And this is called as the cardiac output. Got it? So the volume of blood pumped by the heart into the number of times the heart pumps blood in a single minute. So that is 70 into 72, which comes to approximately 5 liters of blood, and that is called as the cardiac output. Okay, so did you all understand the cardiac cycle, which refers to the repeated contraction and relaxation of the heart, which is called as the cardiac cycle, and how the blood from the atrium enters into the ventricles, and from the ventricles they are pumped into the pulmonary circulation and the systemic circulation, and how the atrioventricular valves open and close, how the semilunar valves open and close, and what is a joint diastole, and from one joint diastole to the next joint diastole, it is called as the cardiac cycle. That is, the repeating pattern of the contraction and the relaxation of the heart is called as cardiac cycle. During each cardiac cycle, the heart produces two prominent sounds which can be easily heard through a stethoscope. The first sound is lub, which is produced by the closing of the atrioventricular valves. It is low pitch and of longer duration. And the second sound is dub, which is produced by the closure of the semilunar valves of the pulmonary artery and the aorta. This dub sound is high pitched and it is of shorter duration. So let me explain to you in detail how exactly these are produced. So in this image you can see all the four chambers of the heart are in a relaxed state. That is, they are in a state of joint diastole. We know that the contracted state of the heart is called as systole and the relaxed state of the heart is called as diastole. So here in the beginning, all the four chambers of the heart are in a relaxed state. That is, they are in a state of joint diastole. Now, the increase in pressure of the atrium causes the blood to flow from the atrium to the ventricle. In addition to that, the electric impulse generated by the sinoatrial node causes increased blood flow from the atrium to the ventricle. So now the atrium are in a contracted state, that is atrial systole, and the ventricles are in a relaxed state, that is ventricular diastole. So this stage lasts for 0.1 seconds. After this, at this stage, remember the semilunar valves are closed. Okay. Now moving on to the next stage where the ventricles are in a contracted state. So now the increase in the pressure in the ventricles forces the atrioventricular valves to close so that there won't be a backflow of the blood from the ventricles to the atrium. So this is where the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae play an important role. That is, when the ventricular contractions happen, they force the atrioventricular valves to close so that there won't be any backflow of blood from the ventricles to the atrium. So this causes the first heart sound, which is lub. Okay, so during ventricular contraction, in order to prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles to the atrium, the atrioventricular valves close. This produces the first heart sound, which is lub. Okay, at this time, the semilunar valves of the pulmonary artery and the aorta are open and the blood is pumped into the pulmonary artery for pulmonary circulation from the right ventricle and from the left ventricle into the aorta for systemic circulation. Okay, so as in how the blood is pumped from the ventricles to the pulmonary artery and the atrium, the ventricle starts relaxing. So at this stage you can see ventricle systole, that is ventricular systole, and atrial diastole happens. That is, when the ventricles are in a contracted state, the atrium are in a relaxed state. So at this stage, the semilunar valves are open, whereas the atrioventricular valves are closed. So this stage lasts for 0.3 seconds. Okay. Now, after this, after ventricular contraction, the ventricle starts to relax. Blood is being pumped into the pulmonary artery and the aorta, and the blood pressure inside the artery and the aorta are high, whereas because the ventricles are relaxing, the pressure in the ventricles are low. This might result in the backflow of the blood from the artery and the aorta into the ventricles. To prevent this, the semilunar valves of the pulmonary artery and the aorta are closed. Okay, so during ventricular diastole, there is a low pressure in the ventricles, and in order to prevent the backflow of the blood from the pulmonary artery and the aorta into the ventricles, the semilunar valves are closed. This causes the second heart sound, which is dub. This sound is of high pitch and it is of shorter duration. Okay, so after this, all the four chambers, okay, wherein the both the atrium and both the ventricles are relaxed. At this time, the semilunar valves are closed and the atrioventricular valves are open. This stage lasts for 0.4 seconds. Okay, this stage of joint diastole, wherein all the four chambers of the heart are in a relaxed state, lasts for 0.4 seconds. So if you add up all of these three, you get a total of 0.8 seconds. So one cardiac cycle lasts for 0.8 seconds. Okay, so I hope you understood the cardiac cycle, the atrial systole, atrial diastole, ventricular systole, diastole, and we also discussed the cardiac output. We also discussed the sinoatrial node, atrioventricular node, how the impulse, electric impulse of the sinoatrial node brings about the contraction of the atrium simultaneously, and how the atrioventricular node, the impulse which travels from the atrioventricular node brings about contraction of the ventricles. I hope overall you got a very good understanding of the entire conducting system in the human heart. If you have any queries or if you have any suggestions, you can write it down in the comment section below. You can also connect with me on my social media handles for more such informative videos and much more. For more such informative videos, you can like, share, comment and subscribe. Thank you.